Welcome everybody, TennesseeRedStar back with a brand new video. So, Zohran predictably won his mayoral race in New York City. I believe that's something that any of us saw coming, considering the numbers and the turnout in the primary, even though they weren't expecting him to even win the primary. A lot of people were expecting the primary to go to Cuomo. However, the momentum that was behind him at that point honestly made the primary certain and made the general election all more certain. Now, I have my personal thoughts on Zohran. I have my personal critiques of Zohran and certain decisions that he's made on his campaign trail, in particular, some of the backsliding he's done on some of his own words and some of his own policies. Like, for example, I personally wouldn't have apologized for the NYPD comments, to tell you the truth. Would have gave them some clarification, nuance, and context so that like the officers understood that it may not be an attack on them individually, however, it's an attack on the institution in which they work in, which feels like an attack on them individually. However, it's an attack on the institution of policing is how I would have clarified that. I wouldn't keep Tish. I wouldn't keep the NYPD Commissioner Tish around. I believe that that's a mistake. I want to say I'm sure they have their reasons for it, but yeah, it's a decision I personally would make. I personally wouldn't have kept around an NYPD commissioner who's ideological Zionist. Secondly, now he was running on the Democratic ballot line, and having Sanders in his campaign, support his campaign, as well as AOC did help with momentum, but he honestly had a lot of momentum before either of those two even caught wind of his campaign or started to really pay attention to his campaign and support it like that. However, I do feel that he got a little too close to them, and that did affect some of his messaging. That did have an impact on some of his messaging. Who knows? Politics is messy, understandable, and certain decisions are made to win. However, you want to be careful and make sure you aren't betraying your principles and capitulating and condemning Hamas when he can easily just avoid that subject altogether and hammer down the point, which he was doing well on early on in this campaign, of I'm running for mayor of New York City. I'm not running for prime minister of Israel. I'm not running to represent Palestine in the UN. I'm not running for a position in Palestine. I'm running for the mayor of New York City. Let's say focus on the issues of New York City. Criticisms aside, because like I said, there's plenty to criticize the guy on. That win was objectively a good thing for the U.S. left. It showed that despite all the smears, despite the many times they called this guy, who's a fucking social democrat at worst, and at best a democratic socialist, which is what he is from his own words, from his own mouth, he's a democratic socialist. And I believe he's more ideologically aligned with the Bread and Roses caucus of DSA, which is more of like a centrist caucus within DSA. There's a good video I'll reference if you want to know the politics, understand the politics of DSA and what the caucuses are and what purposes they serve. I'm going to link a video in the description instead of doing my own video on the politics of DSA, because there is a comrade who explained that very well, who laid it out very well. The politics of DSA, the ideological alignments of the different caucuses and their purposes. However, Bread and Roses is where Zohran himself, in his own words, ideologically aligns within DSA. So, despite all the smears, despite the many times they've called him a communist, they called him a jihadist, voters in New York didn't care. They showed up in overwhelming numbers. We're seeing like numbers that haven't been seen since like 1969. The same voting blocks that Kamala failed to capture in November of last year, Mamdani captured this year. I mean, the guy's hitting double digits in young voters, in young adult voters, like 18 to 29, despite being called a communist, which means the memory of the Red Scare is fading. And we on the left would be fools to allow this opportunity to slip and go to waste, to capture this energy, educate more people about socialism, about the shortcomings of social democracy and the limits of social democracy within the system of capitalism, the limits of the electoralist approach. We see electoralism as more of a tool rather than a means for true radical change, rather than a means for the real, rather than a means for liberation. We see it as a tool. And there are also limitations on what you can accomplish within this existing system. For example, Zohran is just won Zohran is mayor. Has just won the mayoral race of New York City. He's not the governor of New York. He's not the president of the United States. However, in all of those cases, he would still be operating within the existing state machinery. And there would still be limitations on what he could actually do. And if he wanted to do some real radical change, I'm talking like communist level change, like, because his policies are more reformist policies. But if he had a real radical and revolutionary agenda that fundamentally changed the way that society would be in New York, he would literally have to gut the existing state infrastructure and replace it with a new one that would allow that. Because our current system doesn't allow that. Is what I'm getting at. Our current system does not allow that. There are things that he will be able to do. Life in New York City will like become at least more decently more affordable for people who live there. Yeah, his policies will be good for the people of New York City, but they won't be revolutionary. There will still be people living in like extreme poverty in New York City. You may have people who might be able to afford the city a little bit more, but there will still be extreme poverty. There will still be people who are at the bottom. So there isn't any revolutionary change coming from his administration. Not necessarily by faults of Zohran, but because of the existing limitation, because of the limitations of the existing system that he's operating under. So I believe that moments like that, because there will be moments of disappointment through this administration. There will be moments of disappointment with Zohran, moments of disappointment with the system itself, moments of disappointment with the establishment, and even like other branches of the government in New York City, including the federal government, which we're going to get into after this. But those moments of disappointment for the folks who voted for Zohran and are excited at like this new chapter for New York City, those are people who should be shown, who should be pointed to channels like this, channels like S4A, channels that do these readings and book summaries that explain why social democracy, the limitations of social democracy and the limitations of reformist policies within the existing capitalist state structure. For example, Reform or Revolution by Rosa Luxemburg. There are components within the existing system that would make the implementation of that policy extremely difficult. For example, if Zohran instead of promising like rent freezes, he promised government subsidized apartments, but wasn't able to fulfill that. That's a prime moment where you can point people to a book like Reform or Revolution. Now, that's not to say you give them the book in hand and say, "Hey, you read this now." However, you can package it to them in the best way that you can, then point them to channels like this or channels like S4A, or any channel that has done a reading or a breakdown or summary of Rosa Luxemburg's Reform or Revolution. Because why? Because for people to understand something like the limitations of the electoral route, they have to witness something for themselves that changes their perspective. And bells will start going off in their head. They'll start asking certain questions, but they won't have the answer. Us on the left can provide that answer. And I believe that's important because all of this energy will most definitely get co-opted by the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party will see all of this energy behind Zohran and will do their best to co-opt it. And that's something we've been dealing with for honestly the past decade. The Democrats seeing a candidate, grassroots candidate, socialist, leftist, or social democrat, or grassroots issue and co-opting that. because there really isn't any strong left-wing organization behind that that's already like the face behind that cause, or the face behind that candidate. The biggest mistake that we, the U.S. left, can make is allowing all this energy to get co-opted by the Democratic Party. Instead of keeping all of this energy within, the DSA, PSL sphere, because despite being different organizations, DSA, PSL are organizations that are advocating for socialism and fighting for it. DSA is just much more big tent than PSL is. Some ideological differences with chapters, however, still fighting for socialism. So what does that look like as well, outside of just educating people on the limitations of electoralism and the limitations of social democracy, and attempting to bring about radical change within our already existing capitalist state structure? I highly encourage you to run for office yourself if you have it in you. That does not mean you run to try to win. That does not mean you raise a shit ton of money to run to try to win. Depending on the situation and the circumstance, maybe a good idea to try to run and win, but you have to remember there are limitations on what you can actually accomplish in office, especially if you're in like Zohran's situation. You have a hostile federal government to contend with. For some people in this country, they have a hostile state government and a hostile federal government to deal with. If you're a socialist running for office in a red state like Tennessee, where I'm at, you're going to be dealing with likely a hostile local government, a hostile state government, for sure a hostile state government, and a hostile federal government. It's going to be hard for you to actually get things done. You won't be compromising with liberals, you will be compromising with fascists. That's what'll be happening. You'll be in a governing body with fascists. And so rather, the strategy should be advertise the party, advertise the socialist movement, educate the masses on the necessity for things like a general strike, the necessity for withholding our labor, the necessity for a new system, how the capitalist system affects us in many ways. There's a lot you can study from the Zohran campaign, and you can run a good campaign, reach a lot of people, advertise your party, whatever party you're aligned with, y'all's program, and allow people to imagine a better world and a better future for something they can actually organize outside of the electoral system for something they can organize outside of an election for. They don't have to be involved with that during an election year. It's something they can be involved with every year and work towards every year. Now, as far as Mamdani's issues on the federal level, it's been a day since he won. From the time I'm recording this video, it's been exactly 1 day since he won, and they spent hundreds of millions of dollars to keep this man out of office, and yet he still won. I read The Tragic Events in Chile by Enver Hoxha on this channel for a reason. The day before his election, the day before the NYC mayoral election, I read that on this channel for a reason, the exact day before, because I think we can also look to history and in another country as an example of like just how far that the powers that be, the capitalist class, I'll name them flat out, the capitalist class, how far they're willing to go to maintain their wealth. These aren't people who are going to just let you legislate their wealth away. That's just the damn truth. Allende wasn't overthrown in 1970. The coup didn't happen in 1970. It happened in 1973. Zohran's got his entire mayoral term to serve. Do not kid yourself into thinking that Zohran will serve out this entire mayoral term without at least some kind of attempt to deport him or an attempt on his life. You have to understand, one of the many limitations of the electoral road to socialism, or the many limitations of social democracy, I would say, even, but really it's more so the limitations of the electoral road to socialism, You cannot challenge capital without expecting a violent reaction. And that includes deportation, because deportation is violence. You cannot expect to, you have to anticipate some kind of violent reaction by the ruling class when you challenge capital. You cannot challenge capital without some kind of violent backlash that is usually the last resort. It's violent back. So as he implements his policies, understand, understand what is likely to happen throughout his time in office as mayor. That's not to rain on anyone's parade, anyone celebrating this win, or to shit on anyone's hope. It's just reality. This is historical precedent. What they do to folks abroad, they will do at home. And we know this administration, the Trump administration, has no shame. They have no bar. There's no bar for them. There's no bar for fascists. The Trump administration aren't the only group of fascists that would want Mamdani deported or killed. You've got Israeli interests. You've got, of course, people who are just generally uh, anti-Islamophobic and xenophobic, white nationalists generally. But the main two, or the main fascist threats from Ramdani are from the Israeli interests and American corporate interests. Those are Mamdani's main threats. So I'm gonna end this video off because that's really all the commentary I really need. All the commentary I really felt like giving on this, basically saying, hey, Mamdani's win, objectively good for the left, and we need to harness this energy and keep this energy on in our movement for socialism and not allow this energy to get co-opted by the Democratic Party. We need to be ready to educate the people who voted for Mamdani, or educate the people who were happy about his win, on the limitations of social democracy, the limitations of the electoral road to socialism, the limitations of trying to implement radical change in the current capitalist system, and how to implement true revolutionary change that will benefit the working class and change the way that our society works, would require the old state to be gutted and destroyed and replaced with a new one. Basically using moments of disappointment, whether those moments of disappointment are with Zohran, the New York state government, the city council members, state government, or the system itself. Use those as a springboard to educate people on the shortcomings of social democracy and trying to implement revolutionary socialist change within the current capitalist state system. And then just staying sharp for attempts on Zohran, whether those are attempts at deporting him, or attempts at killing him, or just attempts to undermine and sabotage his administration, because there will definitely be attempts at that too. Like I said, they spent hundreds of millions of dollars making sure he did not win. He still won. And as I said earlier, Allende wasn't overthrown in 1970. He won in 1970, but he wasn't overthrown in 1970. He was overthrown in 1973. Things take time, so just stay sharp. And honestly, if you're in an organization, especially DSA or PSL, and especially if you're in New York City, but nationwide, honestly, your chapter should. I strongly advocate for your chapter to have a contingency plan on hitting the streets immediately in protest, in mass protest, should something happen to Zohran, whether it's deportation or assassination. Y'all need to have contingency plans on getting out in the streets and shutting down the streets if something happens to him. There has to be consequences, 100%. There has to be. But those are my thoughts. Let me know what you think in the comment section down below, and I'll see you on the next video. Till next time.